100%. That's awesome. That's the best way to do it. And more specifically, if you're going to do scanning on a regular cadence and you want them to all be perfectly aligned, let's lean into the survey targets and let's do that. Let's tie into control.
Welcome to the Reality Capture Network, where we focus on technology-driven innovation, education, and community. The Reality Capture Network, bringing the future to you. On this episode of the RCN podcast, the product manager at Avvir, Brad Shapiro.
I was fortunate that I was part of the last cohort that actually started at my school with drafting by hand. And then we moved to CAD. And then by the time I graduated, we were already fully in Revit. So I kind of got to see like the full spectrum while I was studying, which was fun. Starting a project with a high accuracy laser scan is always a good call. Let's get out there with something on a tripod, please.
All the way to scanning at the very end of a job to have a final as-built.
It starts with a conversation and a bit of learning and understanding, what's the high risk part of this project that could be mitigated with the use of laser scanning or reality capture on this job, but there's no way to kind of get involved without just giving it a shot.
All right, welcome to another episode of the Reality Capture Network podcast. Today, we're excited to be talking with Brad. Thanks for joining us today.
Yeah, super excited to be here.
I know that you're doing some fun things in technology, and but before we get into the current and what you're doing, I always like to dig in with guests on a little bit of their background and hear their journey of how they got into the industry and what their interests were, and kind of some of the career path that took you into where you are today, and then we'll dig into the current and the future.
So yeah, originally I studied architectural drafting, and that's how I kind of initially got into the space of construction and design. I was fortunate that I was, I think, part of the last cohort that actually started at my school with drafting by hand. And then we moved to CAD, and then by the time I graduated, we were already fully in Revit. So I kind of got to see like the full spectrum while I was studying, which was fun. I ended up moving into construction management for my undergrad, but I kind of kept that like BIM savviness and technology embedded approach towards my studies in construction management. And that's really what led me to ending up on kind of the VDC and BIM side of things. I was really fortunate that very early on in my career, I got introduced to laser scanning. So I started laser scanning on job sites maybe around 2014, which at that point in time in Canada was pretty early for laser scanning in the construction space. And honestly, that's when I got hooked. I just kind of picked it up and ran with it and couldn't put it down. And that's kind of been something that's carried me through and really changed the trajectory of my career to working both in the BIM and VDC space for general contractors, as well as in the reality capture space on the owner side, and then ultimately has led me to where I am now, which is working on the software side and actually leading a software engineering team to build out software for reality capture technology.
That's awesome. So when you were first learning about laser scanning, what was kind of your initial view on it, and what were some of the first things you actually did with scanning?
Yeah. So I grew up, I think the reason why it struck a nerve with me is I grew up doing a lot of film-based photography. I had access to a darkroom as a teenager, and that was something I was super into and still am now. And just some of the principles with especially early laser scanning, where it was a little less, set it down and press go and scan. It was more like, okay, like set up your surveyor's tripod and your targets on surveyor's tripods and hit your targets and set up all your coordinates before you run the scan, which is then going to take like 10 minutes.
Yeah.
And I think some of the parallels between like all the preparatory work aligned with so much with what I had been doing in like the film photography space, that's where I kind of got hooked on it. And then, some of the more interesting projects that got me started as well, I mentioned previously when we had spoke, I scanned some power plants and worked with like some radioactive spaces. Like that was a really interesting project to take on. And then through later into my career when I was working with WeWork for a period of time on their laser scanning team, I spent a good amount of time in Europe and was fortunate to be able to scan a bunch of like heritage buildings in Paris and in Frankfurt, and spend time kind of in a whole different type of building structure that I wasn't really familiar with. You know, how it is on your own with your laser scanner out there on the job site. It was just fun to kind of have that experience. I was used to it in the States and in Canada, but having that experience in Europe in a totally new environment was really interesting as well.
Yeah, that's really cool. That's one of the things that I think has been really exciting about really reality capture in whole, whether we're talking about a scanner or LiDAR on drone or cameras, is just the applications that it has across so many different industries and project types. And the more that the awareness of these tools and the technologies has grown, the more industries we see adopting it and companies figuring out how to use it. And I think, you know, over the last 10 years, even up to where we are today, the industry kind of follows what your journey has been, which is going from, okay, there's a device, let's figure out how to capture things. And it was very difficult, 10, 15 years ago. It was a tedious process. There wasn't, automatic registration and cloud to cloud and SLAM doing super amazing things. It was a tedious process. It was expensive. It was slow. The registration was manual targets. And so now we've seen over 10 years, the devices get easier to use. They become more affordable. And so now the adoption is growing. It's creating way more data, and now we're looking at the data. And the big question mark so many firms have always said is, okay, it's a really cool technology, but what do I do with the data? So now we see this big increase of focus on, well, what can we do with it? Can we create meshes? Can we create walkthroughs? Can we pull out, analytics of the data and simulate things and, use it for safety and training and so on? And so that's kind of led to, some of your journey into where you are today. So what is the current, focus for you?
My current focus? Yeah, it's a broad spectrum. I think, generally speaking, I'm really just kind of fascinated with and excited to work on projects that kind of push the envelope for technology in the construction space. I think things I'm excited about in reality capture, honestly, are even more simple things like 360 photography. So you think about platforms like Struction Site or like OpenSpace, for example. These types of platforms have just made it so much more accessible for people to even understand what reality capture means and encompasses. And I find that actually has been really helpful in my career as, for lack of a better term, kind of like a gateway drug into laser scanning and actually working with point clouds. So for me right now, my focus is really on building software that can leverage some of these data sets that many of our customers already have, being 360 photo capture or laser scans from their job sites, and getting them to speak to their BIM models and their project schedule and their project estimate, and pulling insights out of that reality capture data when compared to something like the BIM model or the project estimate. So my focus right now is kind of delivering two things. It's delivering a high-level understanding of project health based off of these inputs and outputs, but also delivering a very granular, detailed analysis of, the state of a project schedule or estimate. So that's kind of my focus right now, where my head's at, but I'm trying to, at the same time, think big picture and make sure that I'm, not missing out on any other new technology in the space, because it is growing so quickly. Hardware and software is really just evolving at such a rapid pace right now in this space.
Yeah, no, it really is. And I would love for you to share a little bit about your thoughts. So I think a big focus for you guys as a company is really like the construction space, right? Could you share some of your thoughts around what you've seen with some of that transition of like individual scans for a project versus the idea of ongoing scans or monitoring, or, I know, like you mentioned, you guys are looking at taking data and pulling more information out of it, helping clients get more value. Where do you see some of that in the industry, the transition of that, and or the benefits people are seeing out of it?
Yeah, that's a good question. For a period of time, I worked for a large contractor out of New York City. And before I joined their team, they did not perform laser scanning in-house, and they would contract some of it out. But it was a very limited budget for reality capture. It was not something where they were scanning in intervals, for example. So for me, if you're just getting to this space and you're on the construction side, depending on the type of work you're doing, but in my experience, I did a lot of adaptive reuse and renovation. For me, the most critical time to scan is pre-construction. It's post-demo and before you start building what is new or the renovated space. And better yet, if you can get buy-in from the design team to look at that point cloud before you start building, then that's, in my experience, has been the biggest win. And where I've had a lot of fun was kind of like bringing design teams into the process and being kind of like the provider of this tool, this point cloud that can answer so many of their unknowns and validate their design before we get into, coordination, let alone installing MEPs and all the headaches that could result from that. But there's been a lot of change. So, that's the last couple of years while I was working on that side. Since I've moved to the software side, what I'm seeing now is a lot of major GCs own their own hardware. They have 360 cameras. They have laser scanners. Some of them have handheld laser scanners. We've seen tools like the Navis VLX, for example, or maybe the BLK2Go. These have really unlocked the ability to scan not just once during pre-construction to validate your design, but to scan pre-demo and post-demo and after your major MEPs were installed and maybe after your walls were framed or your top and bottom track were installed. So I'm starting to see more of a common thread here where contractors are interested in scanning on a regular basis. And in my opinion, I think part of that is as a result because I think the technology side of things has caught up to make both the capture easier, but also the software has caught up to make it easier to get value out of the data sets and actually gain insights from those data sets.
Yeah, no, I think that's been a huge piece. And in fact, it makes me kind of just think about when we look at the different tools and technologies, sometimes people look at, a new device coming out the wrong way. They think, oh, there's a mobile scanner. Well, we don't need terrestrial scanning anymore because the mobile's faster. Or we don't need any of those expensive scanners anymore because the iPhone can scan. And it always leads back to that, no, we should think about all these tools that are coming out as not that they completely replace each other, but they're making different uses of scanning possible. It might not be financially feasible or the ROI there to use high-end terrestrial scanners with survey control, on a weekly basis to track monitoring because it is expensive. It does take a long time, but if you do your base scan with that high accuracy because you are going to design from it and now you're looking for monitoring, well, it's actually becoming affordable now because those mobile scanners are fast enough. You can knock it out in a day and that ROI is there. So, and then we look at even like the phone. How can we integrate something like scanning with a phone to capture small spaces? Everyone has a phone in their pocket. So we don't want to look at those devices either and say, hey, they're too cheap, they're not good enough. We as a community, as we look at these new technologies, we should work together to say, where does it fit? How can we integrate it into the project? And maybe it's that the construction site, the superintendent learns how to use his phone and he can go capture things that change on a weekly basis and send it to the project team, who has the other data set. And so I love looking at all the different devices that have come out and the changes we've seen over 10 years, 15 years. And the software is huge. So many companies now are looking at how do we make the data easier to access, easier to get to, cloud-based hosting, because that's been a big issue. And I still see so many questions about that today is like, what do we do with this data? If we start doing a lot of scanning, we're getting terabytes of point cloud files, and most of our team is working on laptops and our servers are overloaded. Would you share a little bit of your thought on, you guys are seeing that use within construction. You guys are on the software side. What do you think about the data piece, some of the change we've seen there and maybe how people are managing that or?
Yeah, for sure. I mean, I think I saw one of your previous discussions with John Niles, for example. And you guys discussed like even like physically mailing a hard drive to like a customer or a client or someone on your team. And I've been there. I've mailed a hard drive. It is a funny thing to think about. And so there's definitely there's a lot of space for overkill in reality capture. And even I look back to early in my career, I was going out on job sites with a Leica P20 or P40, like these huge pieces of equipment that were, in hindsight, so overkill for the level of detail that I needed for these interior renovations and fit outs. So I think data is really important. I also am very interested in seeing how the hardware has changed and how it's made capture so much easier. I think about the Leica RTC and how it's got that Viz alignment tool that it knows where it is in a space. And I've experienced that and done registration through, Cyclone 360 versus Cyclone Classic, which is where I kind of cut my teeth. And it's exciting to see that development. And I think in terms of data management, we're just seeing similar innovations where you're able to more easily produce point clouds of a lower resolution or decimate them. We're seeing software that's able to handle point clouds better. Like you can, append point clouds into Navisworks or Revit, and it's usable. Whereas there was points in the time where previously it was a lot less user friendly. And then we're also seeing a lot of cloud hosted programs, even similar to our platform, which is not by any means the best point cloud viewer in the space, but like we're able to stream point clouds in a browser based software product to a reasonably high level of detail that for general purposes, for most users, for validating work in place or deviations, is more than enough resolution. It's not, the type of platform where I would necessarily do like a structural inspection for a bridge or something, a key piece of infrastructure, but for, determining what pieces of sheet metal were or were not installed last week on my hospital renovation, it's great. And that's really cool to me because there was a period in time where it required not only a lot of specialized knowledge and experience, but also a lot of specialized software to access. And looking even at a platform like Cintu is another good example, being able to look at point clouds and mesh point clouds, again, in a browser-based platform. It's amazing. It just makes it more accessible. It means that maybe my project manager will actually look at this. And I bet you my trade partners definitely will, especially on the drafting side. So for me, that like increased level of accessibility, I think has just skyrocketed adoption in the last few years, which I think is a big win for everyone in kind of the digital construction space.
Yeah, absolutely. And I know you mentioned a little bit of what you're working on now, but just because I am curious, and I'm sure others listening are too, would you give us a little bit of a deep dive into what is your platform actually being used for right now, and what types of things are you actually trying to do with that data and value that people are getting out of it?
Yeah, of course. Happy to. So I work at Avvir right now, and we consider ourselves to be a reality analysis platform is kind of our term that we like to use. And essentially what we do is when we take those models and schedules of values from our customers, we use reality capture data, 360 photos and laser scans from the field to basically validate work in place. That's most of like what it boils down to. It is against my schedule, have I installed as much of this scope of work as I had intended to by now? And giving our customers a very clear view of kind of the yes/no to that. And that helps our customers understand, what scopes of work or trade partners they need to potentially keep an eye on, or teammates they need to have a discussion with. Beyond that, we also look at the cost metrics, so we can absorb a project schedule and we can determine your earned value based off of all the line items in your work breakdown structure. And again, that's probably our deepest dive, and getting most granular is looking at earned value and validating pay applications for general contractors. And then for me, like the reason why I joined the company, because I was working so much in this space, is we provide basically a quality analysis for all of your scope of work that has been installed. So via a point cloud data set, we can determine not only has a piece of MEP been installed or not, but we can determine if it's installed in the correct location. And this is something in my experience, as a VDC manager, just bit me so many times that a trade partner would install something outside of what we had coordinated in our BIM model and outside of what we had released for fabrication. And nobody knew until they went to install their scope of work, and it was in the way. And it caused a hard conflict in the field, and it's tools down, people stop working, we got to re-coordinate, or we got to tear something out and rebuild it. And what we allow our users to do is basically just get a very early understanding. As soon as something's installed incorrectly, we can let them know, and then they can proactively decide, do we want to tear that out and reinstall, or is it, a major piece of MEP and we're best off to leave it and let's re-coordinate our, fire protection main to go around it or something like that. So that's kind of the space we're working in right now.
So I'm curious on that piece. So for like the tracking, so you've got the way you're accomplishing that, you have the design model loaded into your platform, and you're scanning on site, bringing the point cloud in, and confirming that whatever has been captured in the scan, because that's what's built now, is you're validating that against the design to see if things are in the right place.
Yep, exactly. We typically take the model after the BIM coordination process. So like that signed off, released for fabrication model is what we work off of. And our algorithm basically just understands where everything is supposed to be because we ingest that model first. And each time you drop in a point cloud, our algorithm works to basically just validate through that point cloud what's in place and what's not. And frankly, like that's seemingly, on paper, it feels easy, like what's there, what's not there. But on the job site, on, maybe a small reno, it's a little bit different, but you're talking about, a super tall skyscraper in Manhattan, 70 stories, or a large pharmaceutical plant, or a ground up construction hospital. Go out and ask a super or a PM, exactly where are you at with plumbing today?
Yeah.
What is and is not installed? And and that's not to say that they're not good at their jobs, but it's just to say that there's so many moving parts on a job site that level of granularity and understanding of what is in motion or is not is nearly impossible actually to understand.
Yeah.
And it's exciting to be able to give those answers to project teams because then they're equipped with that knowledge and they can execute a little better.
Yeah, that's awesome. So in that scenario, what would you say, because this goes back to that question of like, okay, a one-time scan up front, now we have some accurate data to build from. Now we are talking about actually scanning during construction in order to try to see the quality of the build and the progress of the build, but that means some phased scanning. So what would you say you're seeing from companies that are implementing this type of process? How often do they scan, or what's overkill, or what seems on like a reasonable pace on a project?
Yeah, that's a good question. And again, it really does depend on kind of the scope of the project and its level of complexity. But what we see most often is we can leverage 360 photographs for progressing the model, basically statusing elements as built or not built. We need a laser scan for that deviation analysis. So what we see most often is customers are doing very frequent photo captures because there's a lot of benefits for their project team in having a well-populated construction site, for example. And we use those photos to give them that progress analysis on a very frequent basis, sometimes once a week, twice a week, even more depending on the complexity of the job. And then we usually suggest that a scan is supplemented, again, depending on the complexity of the job. It could be once a month, it could be once every 2 weeks. Again, on some of these kind of like a ground up hospital where there's a lot of heavy overhead MEPs and copper piping, maybe a weekly basis is a better cadence in that type of scenario. But there's kind of a broad spectrum there and it's best fit to the project. But again, even a scan once a month with a photo capture once a week, that's not the level of reality capture that I had the permission to dive into when I worked on the construction side.
Yeah, I mean, doing it more than once is the new phase. Again, historically, and even today still, most projects that scan, they're coming in and scanning one time to get an as-built, design from that, and build. I believe we're just now at the part, the process in the industry where people are starting to do this. They're like, okay, I love scanning. I've adopted it. I'm sold. I want to scan every job before I build because that data is so accurate. My team can use the photos. Now we're just starting over, I feel like, with, okay, what is next? Next is starting to implement the photos, starting to capture again to check the quality, all the way to scanning at the very end of a job to have a final as-built. It's kind of cool to see the industry has started adopting kind of what I think is that first phase of reality capture, and now we're starting to look at how do we scale even more adoption of these different tools and implement them in different ways. One question I'd like to throw out for that process, because a lot of people don't do this repeated scanning on the same site. And I see a big issue, which is why we're trying to educate around this, on people trying to understand what tool to use and how accurate is it? And do I use survey control? Do I not? How do I know if my data set's accurate enough to compare against the design model and, make adjustments? What's some of your perspective on that piece when you're looking at, accuracy on a project, trying to pick a tool to use and rescan the same site and know that you're actually aligning properly to validate?
Yeah, that's a really good question. That's a loaded question. That's a tough one. I'm worried people are going to email me about my answer to this.
There's no right or wrong answer. This is why I love talking about it, though, because a lot of people may not have an answer. Some are like, hey, everyone's trying to figure this out on their own. And so, but I think it becomes even more important when you are talking about going back and back and back to the same site, and you want the data to align good, consistently. It's not a one-time capture that, just is within itself. So I think it's an important topic to at least bring up.
I agree, 100%. So I will admit that in my experience working with laser scanning, it's been much more kind of ad hoc on the fly. So I've not, in my experience, had the luxury of necessarily always working with survey control. Most of my experience on the GC side was pretty scrappy in and out projects. It's cloud-to-cloud registration, and it's basically a best fit analysis of that point cloud to the existing BIM model. And to be totally honest with you, I, in my career, had a ton of success with that. I think in the construction space, generally speaking, outside of like specialty scenarios, that level of detail and level of accuracy has been fine for me.
Yeah.
But again, it really varies project to project. And so we always recommend for our customers, if you have a terrestrial laser scanner and you are set up to capture survey control and align your point cloud that way, 100%, that's awesome. That's the best way to do it. And more specifically, if you're going to do scanning on a regular cadence and you want them to all be perfectly aligned, let's lean into the survey targets and let's do that. Let's tie into control. And that, I think, results in really accurate point clouds and a consistent alignment scan to scan, which is great. But not all projects or customers are set up for that. So I think that in terms of level of quality, like you mentioned before, like I think starting a project with with a more high accuracy laser scan is always a good call. If you're basing design off of this point cloud and coordinating around existing conditions, let's get out there with an RTC 360 or something on a tripod, please. And maybe that will change. And then in terms of like regular capture for statusing a BIM for progress and that type of analysis, I don't know that you have to be out there moving a tripod around and maybe tying into targets. I haven't personally used the Leica BLK to go, but it looks cool. And I've seen some of the data sets and I've seen some of our customers' data sets. And I think generally speaking, for a lot of construction applications, it's probably more than sufficient if you're just looking to document what's there in terms of understanding progress and validation of work in place. But again, I think that's a long-winded answer, but it's always a big thought process of how you want to capture your job site, how you want to align it to the BIM. There's not really an easy way, but there's a lot of different ways.
Yeah. Well, and that's why I like bringing it up and at least getting people's thoughts or perspectives is that I think that the more use cases that come out for the data, the more important it is to understand all the different tools and understand the different workflows, understand accuracies of different devices, understand how to mitigate some of the errors that build up with, SLAM, right? Has drift, and even terrestrial scanners. A lot of people that even think terrestrial scanning is the ultimate thing, they also don't know that, okay, well, if you run out there with a terrestrial scanner and do 500 scans, you're going to have inches and inches and inches of error built up, maybe even up to 6 inches or a foot. You get a little bit of error when you do these building of multiple hundreds of scans. And you also have the issue that sometimes your data might be tilted or it might be shifted and so for a lot of cases, that's totally okay. But the more that we start expanding the options of what we do with that data is where we have to bring those things into question, because sometimes an architect will ask us to go do a as-built of a building, right? And they're like, look, if we go out with tape measures, we're lucky if we get 6 inches. So if it's better than that, we're good. Okay, we know that for 6 inches, we can use any of those devices and no control, and we're good. But now the structural engineer says this is a high accuracy project where we're fabricating steel and we're trying to know measurements within 1/8 of an inch. Now that completely changes our approach, maybe the gear we would use, if we need to validate it with secondary control. Those are the things where, I've seen over the years, there's so many different devices today. The companies that are getting started, in the last 1 or 2 years, it's honestly harder than when we started 10 or 15 years ago, because we started with one device and, it was a terrestrial scanner. Here were the workflows. You have to validate it. Now it's almost gotten so easy and there's so many options. It's harder for someone to start today because they don't know where to start. They don't know the differences in the accuracy. They don't know the different devices. So I love talking about it, and more just raising the awareness to people that might listen to this is saying, hey, there are a lot of devices. There are a lot of workflows. They're all different accuracies. They're all different use cases. If you're getting started, try to educate yourself on the differences, or work with people, to consult with people to help you get the right tool and the right workflow for what you're going to use the data for.
Yeah, I totally agree. And honestly, for anyone getting started, try them out. I mean, if you're really serious about this and you're leaning into it, you're starting a business in this space potentially, you can rent these pieces of hardware. For the longest time, when I worked for the last GC I worked for in New York, we didn't own hardware. We didn't want it. It was a liability. Every single job, we rented our equipment from a local service provider. And we even rented, we were always used Leica. I was always into the Leica stuff. We would rent our Cyclone license on a weekly basis, and I would just use Cyclone for a week to register that project and then release the license, and that was it. So my suggestion definitely for people entering this space is to try different things. I may be biased because I was forced into learning this way, and I think at heart I'm a bit old school, but I also think there's a lot of valid lessons to be learned in starting with terrestrial laser scanning and starting with some manual registration. I think that having a deep understanding of how this technology is really pieced together at the end of the day, and where it is really strong and where it's weak and where it can fall apart. You kind of gave me flashbacks there when you're talking about your constraint deviations adding up scan over scan and having a 500 scan registration. And I'm just thinking about registering a 500 scan project in Cyclone Classic, where it's pretty rudimentary in terms of user interface and tools. It's powerful, but I like thinking about that, because you really can't just learn that software. I feel like someone has to sit you down who's been through it, and they have to teach you how to work your way through that. There's no YouTube videos, or not many at least. So I think that, that's maybe not the right option for every potential user, but I think for someone who really wants to get into the weeds, starting with a terrestrial laser scanner and doing some manual point cloud registration is a good way to kind of wrap your head around the technology before moving on to something like a handheld unit.
Yeah, no, absolutely. Okay, let's shift conversation a little. So I think you guys obviously have algorithms and things you're using that are doing analytics, but I want to just kind of more on a broad sense in the industry, get your feel. What do you think about the future of AI being integrated into reality capture and the analysis of data? Is that something you guys talk about a lot or integrate, or, obviously I think it's a big focus out there with all the new advancements with even things like ChatGPT, and everyone's like, how is this going to get integrated? And anyways,
Yep.
No wrong answer here either. Just curious your thoughts on AI in our industry.
Yeah, no, that's a good question. That's a fun question. I will start off by saying a disclaimer. I am not an AI expert.
There you go.
So with that out of the way, I have thoughts and feelings. I think that there's probably a world in which AI will be able to look at a design model, for example, and ingest a point cloud and confirm for you anywhere that the new design clashes with existing conditions. You can do that now, but with little to no human intervention. I think there's also probably a world in which you can upload a point cloud to some sort of platform and say, hey, this is what I want to design through this space, and I'd like it to go from here to here and have this type of feature. And there's maybe a world in which that gets drawn out for you in terms of overhead MEPs and maybe some architectural design. So I think that could be really interesting. I think there's probably a future in which our as-built models are just continuously updated automatically based off of reality capture and leveraging the fabrication models in tandem. So I think there's a lot of potential in that kind of like design and coordination space through to construction validation that I think isn't necessarily something I see as like replacing jobs necessarily, but I see it as being something that could greatly streamline the process and reduce bottlenecks. And I think about, sitting in coordination meetings in New York on these projects with my subs and with my design team and with my project manager. And those would be 8-hour meetings. We would literally start that meeting first thing in the morning. We'd eat lunch in there together and we keep working right until we called it a day. Like, they were grueling meetings. They really wore on you. And it just, in hindsight, they were just maybe due to my VDC management skills, but they just were not super efficient. We're just clearing hit by hit, going through the model. And I do think there's a future state where clash detection and the resolution of clashes during the pre-construction phase is kind of ripe for automation. That shouldn't require 15 people in a room for an 8-hour day. It's just not. Those people all could be spending their time doing things that are so much more beneficial to a project outcome than that exercise. And just for me, my biased opinion coming from that space, I look forward to seeing that type of workflow automated, maybe with AI in the future. No,
that's cool. I appreciate those shares. And, I am the farthest away from like a programmer or understanding what goes into development of software to analyze data or anything like that. But I picture, how cool it would be to have a platform where it's mixing the use of something like a point cloud and ChatGPT. For those that haven't used ChatGPT yet, where it's like, it has studied data, information, and so when you pose it a question, it's not like when you Google something, right? When you Google something, yes, you're asking a question, but the result is it looks for articles and things that have already been written about that. Whereas ChatGPT is taking all the information that it's learned and it's actually giving you an answer. It's not looking for something that's already been written before. It's using its knowledge, its studied information to give you an answer. And I look at something like that where if a ChatGPT model was integrated in with a software that could analyze point clouds, and you could just ask it, take this point cloud of this floor of this construction job and find the lowest and highest point of the floor in elevation. And then it takes the request and does the analysis or the calculations and finds things, or, something like that, where you start seeing being able to ask your software to look for something in point clouds or models or imagery, or take all the panoramics from this last month and find me, what day had the most people on site, or what day did we have the least amount of anything like that. And instead of, again, you having to go search for things, it goes and finds, based on all the information it's studied and read of that project, and can give you answers. I'm like, man, I see something like that in our future, and it's going to be cool.
Yeah, I have two thoughts on that. So first and foremost, I'm really glad you brought up floor deviation analysis, because for me, I don't tell this to a lot of people probably, but that's like my favorite part of laser scanning analysis. I love heat maps of concrete slabs. So it's something, every single project I feel like we worked on when I was on the GC side, we always had issues with concrete levelness. Yeah. And it affects layout of walls and door jambs and floors, like clearances between corridors and operating rooms, for example, in hospitals. Like, it's always a problem. And it's kind of complicated and hard to produce really accurate heat maps that are actionable and have a grid and really clearly explain your highs and lows so you can understand where to cut and fill. A general heat map, sure, but a heat map that you can send to a job site and have the team on a job site open it and say, okay, I know exactly what I have to do with this. That is something that I could totally see being automated, or definitely a streamlined process in that realm would be amazing for, I think, most construction projects. And then in terms of your ChatGPT reference, I think historically speaking, construction has been kind of an industry that lags behind on learning from prior outcomes and their own historical data. And I can see a database full of past project estimates and schedules and RFI documents and pay applications and BIM models and point clouds being kind of the basis for which you can ask this platform, hey, on the last 5 projects, what scope of work ran over budget the most? Or what scope of work had the most deviations with their installation? Or is there a particular subcontractor on my last 4 healthcare jobs that caused major schedule delays? These are the types of questions that I find people on the GC side, on the construction side, ask a lot to each other, to one another. But it seems that no one really has the perfect answer. And I think that the answer's out there. It's just accessing that information is currently very difficult.
Yeah, so I think we're going to definitely see integrations like that. Using that type of technology, we start looking at how can we capture data in terms of geospatial data, but also in terms of project data and speed and cost. And, okay, here's the cost of laser scanning these last 5 jobs. What is my average per square foot on this type of job? Or, things that, yes, we could get the answer now, but it's a very effort, driven process. It's laborious. You got to, we're going to start seeing efficiencies in analyzing data and projecting and simulating different outcomes. I think it's going to be really cool.
Yeah.
What else are you kind of excited about technology-wise, even if it's maybe a little outside of analyzing point clouds? There's a lot of other buzz things going on with, I think drones have made a big improvement over the last several years. And then we hear the words, we talk a lot about digital twins and the metaverse. And what other technologies do you see coming down the pipe?
Yeah. So from my point of view, I see, 2 kind of categories. I see hardware and I see software. I think on the software side, I think digital twins are interesting. I think that the current environment and buzz around digital twins in the construction space is complicated. The value that's being retrieved out of that space right now, the actual value for end users, I think is a little TBD or a little murky. I don't know that I personally have seen, a GC or an owner that's been like, oh my God, this digital twin platform has changed the way that we manage our portfolio of projects and assets.
Yeah,
but
super early.
It may be out there, but yeah, I haven't seen it yet, but I'm excited for that because I do think there's something there that totally changes the way we deal with operations and maintenance of built assets. And also, I would hope like the efficiency of how buildings are run and operated, and how much, how many utilities they require to keep up and running. On the hardware side, I think drones are interesting. I think drones for interior capture is really interesting, and drones that can potentially, small drones that can take off and capture a job site on their own overnight when no one's there, for example. I think that could be a really interesting way to feed more reality capture data into platforms like our own, amongst others. And then I think there's an interesting kind of more, a larger scale hardware play, which obviously we've all seen Boston Dynamics and the robot dogs. And who knows, again, that's another area that I kind of, from what I've seen, question the actual value add. But there's something there. There's definitely something there. It's just, it's baby steps. But I think also there's plays like Dusty Robotics, for example, is a platform that automates layout. And I think that's super interesting because you can not only have a more accurate layout potentially, but you can do it quicker and you can lay out more things. Maybe now it's top and bottom track and it's hangars, or maybe it's where air handler is going to go, or a skid, or a piece of equipment. I think you have more options to lay out more interesting things. I've even seen like the overhead MEPs drawn on the floor slab, which I think is incredible for the team who's actually installing them. But I think more specifically on the hardware side with actually building things, I expect to see robotics supplement high-risk activities. Yeah. Working in elevator shafts, for example, or attaching curtain wall to super high-rise buildings, or any building really that's off the ground. I see hardware being able to supplement those tasks that we still have people doing. And the reality is the safety's come a long way. But those tasks are still super dangerous and leave human beings very exposed. And I think there's room for a lot of progress to be made on like the safety front with robotics and construction.
Yeah, I completely agree. And I love talking about the aspects of technology actually saving lives or, making safer environments. We've sometimes have talked with, emergency response personnel who are working on integrating LiDAR into, the fire department, and AR goggles that can see through smoke. And you're like, that's actually really a great aspect when we look at these technologies. It's always nice to have more efficiency and more profitability, but there's a lot of applications where these technologies actually save lives and make a safer work environment. And that's a huge, thing for companies to look at across all industries, whether it's reducing how many people need to go visit industrial plant that has potential hazards, or be in a nuclear space, or be out on, a high rise. A lot of these technologies, just by creating digital environments, allow people to make decisions sitting in an office in the AC, not getting overheated, not being on elevated surfaces, not being around chemicals. All of those hazards are reduced down to, let's go capture it for a couple days on site, instead of everyone flies out and walks that site and we got to do it 5 times. So safety is a huge aspect that I think maybe often doesn't get talked about enough when it comes to all reality capture technologies. The measurements are great, the accuracy is great, but the safety improvement in so many ways is really massive.
Yeah, I totally agree. I think there's a lot of room there for improvement, and I am sure there's brains focused on innovation in that space. I know of a few that, for example, use machine learning in video and photo capture to be able to determine where like ladders or lifts are used without all the proper safety requirements in place, or where workers are, in like a no access zone, for example, or on like a covered shaft when they're not supposed to be. And it can, not in kind of the means of, tattling on workers on the job site, but more in the vein of being like, hey, like there's some unsafe activities and trends happening on this job site. Let's talk about it and stop doing those things.
Absolutely. In fact, sometimes when we think about hey, let's, like, if there's a camera on site, there's a lot of companies that are starting to install video cameras full time on job sites. And some people look at that and go, oh, that's kind of like, Big Brother, you're watching me the whole time. It's weird. But the other thing that I've heard about it is when people know that there's a camera watching, it's not that you're trying, like you said, trying to point out and be mean about it, but when people know there's a camera watching, they're safer. They don't try to cut corners. They don't, because sometimes people do cut corners because they want to be faster, but when safety is involved and we know that, hey, this is how we operate as a company or a project site, there is cameras, now everyone's like, okay, we are going to be safe. And that, it makes a difference. It encourages safety. So I think that's a big point.
Yeah.
I would love one more thing that I thought of, when we talk about the implementation of a lot of these technologies, I still think that we're at the point that a lot of people are hesitant. A lot of companies are hesitant to change. They're hesitant to integrate new technologies. They think it's difficult. They're used to their old ways. And you guys, again, are even a level above like just getting someone to scan the site for the first time. You're trying to get people to scan constantly and do the progress and do the monitoring and I would love a little bit of your take on that kind of response of how do you see the industry starting to look at these technologies and the adoption, and what's some of the things that you approach when someone is hesitant to change or innovation? Yeah,
that's another good question. I think starting based off of like the trends I'm seeing in the industry is, when Avvir first started, before I joined the company even, part of their platform was a services play because frankly, most GCs didn't have laser scanning hardware. So they would provide capture services for their customers so that the customer could use their software platform. And I think that's not unique to Avvir. I think that's, there's other platforms who have been doing and frankly still are doing a similar type of service delivery. But what's been really encouraging is I think the play all along was not to be in the capture space, but it was to kind of handhold a bit while industry caught up. And what we see now is just like so many contractors are already in pretty deep with reality capture. And I will add, we typically work on larger scale construction projects is where software like ours typically returns the most value. So we're working on, the types of projects that have the types of budgets and GCs that are well equipped to be able to perform that reality capture on a regular basis. But even at a smaller scale, even on the subcontractor side, I'm running into subcontractors now, and they have a laser scanner because they want to validate their work in place, or they want to go out and scan existing conditions for the job they're working on because the GC is not providing it. And they're like, well, we'll do it ourselves because we know how important it is. So there's a lot to unpack there, but I think generally speaking, things are trending in a way in which reality capture is more accessible, it's cheaper, it's easier to get started with, and at smaller scale construction, it's starting to kind of come into play more often. And again, for me, my approach to any GC, because that's usually who I interface with the most, who's hesitant to get started or doesn't know where to get started, I think that collaborating with either like a really good laser scanning service provider who specializes in this space and kind of can understand your project needs and get you started, or maybe it's someone like a software platform that works with this capture data that can provide a little bit of hand-holding. But for me, it's really just trying it out. It's sitting down and understanding, what's the high risk part of this project that we think could be mitigated with the use of laser scanning or reality capture on this job, and kind of working back from there. And I think if you are working with any really reputable laser scanning service provider, they can sit down and have that conversation with you and kind of point you in the right direction for, hey, this is what to expect. This is the type of engagement you're going to want or need from your design team, from your subcontractors. And this is what we think, the value could provide for your actual field team executing the project. I think it starts with a conversation and a bit of learning. And but there's no way to kind of get involved without just giving it a shot.
Jumping in. Yeah. And that's one of the things that I love now. Historically, there was not a lot of content out there to look at or research or white papers and that's one of the reasons I'm putting a shift in focus from just like doing services to trying to create educational content and empower other people to do better capture and teach them how and what devices to use, and then even start gathering other professionals in the industry and start trying to gather these white papers and case studies and bring them all together so that we as an industry have somewhere to point people to educate them, because that's been a challenge historically. It's like anybody who wants to get started today, you're kind of Googling yourself to death and looking at different articles here and by that one. And, there's a lot of information out from each hardware provider and their kind of case studies, but there's never been good resources to learn, unbiased opinions on capture processes or on use cases for jobs. And I think if we collectively create educational content and case studies, I think that's one of the best ways to scale the adoption even more so on all the different applications of how to use the data. Is if we have good case studies, well, we already know one construction firm, or we know one architect or a survey firm or whoever that took that first risk in saying, like you said, we don't know for sure the ROI yet because we haven't done it. You're not a user yet. Let's do the first project. Let's test. Let's see the outcome. There are a lot of companies who've done that, but the knowledge is just internal. And now you have all these other firms who are afraid of taking that first step. That's why I think the educational content can really change the whole industry, is if we have one good case study from one construction firm, we can take it to 50 more construction firms and say, here's what this can potentially look like. Here's the capture process. Here's what we did with the data. Here's the ROI. So I think education is a huge piece that can help the industry.
Yeah, I 100% agree. I think about a couple years ago even, going to the Reality Capture Network conference wasn't an option because it didn't exist.
Yeah.
And it's really been like a pleasure seeing, obviously your efforts amongst others in the industry and being like, okay, like there is a forum for this conversation. There are people who want to learn. There's people who want to speak and share. And it's really exciting. Like I got a text a couple of weeks back asking if I was going to the RCN conference. And I was like, that's so cool because that's not a text I used to get. But yes. And I think education's a big piece. And, we kind of touched on some of the specialty knowledge and some of the silos that I think historically have existed in the reality capture space with like hardware and software that's not very accessible. And I think conversations like this alongside the improvement in innovation in hardware and software are how the industry is going to keep kind of pushing the envelope and bring, everyone else that's working in the same space along with us.
Yeah, absolutely. And it's why I'm really trying to push and encourage more people to be open, to share what they're doing. A lot of people still have that closed wall of like, hey, if we figure out a process, we don't want to tell anyone because it's how we have a leg up on others. And I get certain aspects of that. But anything that's not super proprietary, I encourage people like, come share, talk about the failures, talk about the successes, because if everybody actually comes together as a community around all these new technologies, we can help each other learn from, hey, I integrated this technology this way and it worked really well. Well, now 3 more people who listen to that go, I didn't think about that, but here's how I use the data in this platform to get this analysis. And so the community aspect, I think, along with the education, is how we can really scale. And the other reason I think it's so important is because we all see a resource issue too, right? There's not a lot of brand new people coming out of school with, expertise in laser scanning and virtual reality training and everything right now has been on the job training. Now, if we see the adoption of the tools growing and the adoption industry growing, and there's not a lot of new people being produced, then collaboration and working together with different companies is going to be necessary to handle the volume of work that's out there for all these different industries. So I'm excited. It's a pleasure having you join us and others in the industry. Come share their knowledge, talk about what they're doing, talk about their platforms, because I think awareness around what's possible is step one in really making this implement on a large scale. So many people don't know what all tools are out there. They don't know what softwares are available. They don't know the analytics you can produce. So we want to help connect people to the right solutions, right services, right workflows. And it's exciting seeing it work. People are actually starting to meet from doing things like this and successfully collaborate. That's what we're really shooting for.
Awesome. Yeah. I mean, I'm super excited to just be a part of the conversation and be here today and chat with you. It's been very fun. And I'm excited to kind of see where we go from here and hopefully be at the next RCN conference.
We hope so as well. It'd be great to get together in person and get to meet some more of the community. And I want to leave off with one last question because I've been asking people this, and I love hearing what the response is.
Okay.
If you were to go back 20 years or 15 years, and it may be the same advice that you would give someone younger that's considering getting into this industry, what are some of the things you've learned over your career thus far that you would advise someone younger that's getting in, just on, how they do work or their mindset into business or something specific about construction technology? What's something you would advise?
Yeah. That's a good question. So I used to work with a group called ACE, and we'd mentor high school students who were thinking about careers in architecture, engineering, or construction management. So I've put some time thinking into this, and I've had these discussions with young people. I think for me, especially at a young age in college, especially when you're kind of starting to learn about these technologies, just not saying no to potential opportunities. Like, I think young people are quick to say, oh, well, I don't want to do that. And a good example of that is, my college bought all these laser scanners, all this equipment to start figuring out laser scanning really early on. Like, who knew? And they were like, hey, does anyone want to come learn this stuff? And you can work for the college and do some R&D projects and get paid through the summer. And everyone was like, no, I didn't really like the surveying class. Like, that doesn't sound cool. And I was like, whatever, sure, I'll just do it. And that literally changed not only the trajectory of my career, but the trajectory of my life and where I ended up living and the travel I did in the cities. And now I'm in LA, and it's changed a lot for me. So I think my advice for people interested in construction technology and who are just getting started, is to kind of just lean into everything. Play around with Revit. Check out Navisworks, say yes to opportunities, consider applying yourself to, the BIM and VDC career ladder as opposed to the traditional construction project management career ladder. I think there's still a lot of opportunity in construction technology because the ladder doesn't really exist the same way. Assistant PM, assistant site super, it's been there for a long time. But like you mentioned, young people in laser scanning, reality capture, and construction technology, we're still figuring it out.
Yep.
So I think there's a lot of room for young people to come out of college into this space with energy and enthusiasm, and I think have not only a big impact on the space as a whole, but potentially have a big impact on the way their career looks. So I don't know if that made sense, but I think that's kind of where my head's at on the subject.
No, it really did. I mean, what I got, summarizing what kind of you shared is just don't be afraid to try new things. Don't make your mind up on something before you've done it. I love that. I encourage people a lot. I've really learned over the years when I got excited about what I'm doing for work and being able to start a business, I really try to, when people reach out to me and they're like, hey, my high school doesn't know what he wants to do yet, or I'm getting out of college and I don't even really like what I got a degree in, biology or something else. I'm like, get into this industry and just try something. And even if it's not this industry, I just try to encourage people, try different things and find a way to get into a role that you do enjoy, because when you can enjoy your work and you can become passionate about it, that's where you see that next level really kick in for someone, where they want to learn. They're learning on their own. They're growing and they're learning quickly. And you see them grow the ladder even if that wasn't the plan, just because they're passionate, they're enthusiastic, they're learning. And when you look at our industry, you're right, there is not a tiered ladder right now of like, you have to be a laser scan technician 1. Oh, that doesn't exist. There's no certification, there's no training process. And so the people that do get into this industry in any of those areas and just dive in and get good at it, instantly have a career ahead of them, because there are big companies today that have decided this is necessary. We want someone to come in and run laser scanning. Well, guess what? There's not a lot of director level people to hire because it's still just now growing. So there's a lot more companies that are going to want to hire for this than there are people to do it. So big opportunity ahead. But I love your share. Encourage people to try things out before they get locked in and find a way to enjoy what they do.
Yeah, absolutely. Totally agree.
Well, thanks for being here with us today, sharing with the community. Looking forward to getting this episode posted. I'm sure there's a lot of value in. We'll also be pointing people back that are interested in looking into what you guys have going on. Definitely sounds interesting, and look forward to more conversations with you in the future.
Sounds good. Thanks for the time, Matt.
All right. Thanks for joining us, and we'll see you guys next time.